A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thank you for joining us for another webinar this September. As usual, we start with just a few updates on things, on where we are. I'll just share my screen. So as usual, inshallah, we will start with the reflection on the Quran. Today's topic is on gender identity. And we have talked about gender identity in the past. We were very lucky to have Dr. Miriam Grossman from the States to talk about this. Inshallah, we can look at this at a more Islamic lens today. This verse is from chapter 92. So it says, وَمَا خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى, by the creation of the male and the female. And it says, indeed, your pursuits are diverse. So again, even in these two verses, on a very basic understanding, we are seeing the difference between the male and the female, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about inna sa'yakum lashatta. It's diverse. There's a difference between the male and the female. Another verse that we have, chapter 75, where we are talking about our creation. Was he not a drop of emitted semen? Summa kana aqilatan fakhalaqa fasawwa. Then from that semen, or from that nutfatan, it becomes the clinging form. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala beautifully uses the words fakhalaqa, and he created, fasawwa, he forms, he's the creator, he's the one who designs, he's the one who forms. فَجَعَلَ مِنْهُ الزَّوْجَيْنِ, and it says, and from them, made of them, zawjain, that is two spouses. And then it's very clear what the spouses are in this. There's no room for doubt. The verse follows and says, az-zakara wal-unsa. So the two spouses here we're talking about is the male and the female. And of course, we see the footnote that zawjain instead of spouses here can be interpreted to be two types or two kinds. We have another verse in the Quran which talks about in chapter 42 that lahu mulku samawati wal ard. So Allah belongs the dominion of the heavens and the earth. He creates whatever he wills, and he grants females to whomever he wills, and he grants males to whomever he wills. And again, Allah is making that distinction between the two sexes. And then he says, or he pairs them, males, again, the verses use yuzojuhum, again, the same coupling, the same word is used, zakrana wa unsa, or he pairs them, males and females. And again, he makes whomever he wills barren. So it's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of creation, whether he gives us a male or female. And we have this distinction. This is quite, again, very, very clear, laid out in the Quran. And again, this other verses here, which I'm presenting, is to do with the concept of equality between the male and the female. So man amila saliha, it doesn't matter whoever does the righteous deed, whether male or female, وَهُوَ مُؤْمِن. So there's no distinction between the male and female in terms of righteousness and what they can achieve. We will surely cause him to live a good life, and we will surely give the reward in the hereafter according to the best of what they're doing. أَجْرَهُمْ بِحِسْنِ مِمَّا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ, according to the amal, according to what we're doing in this life. And again, this is repeated in chapter 4. وَمَنْ يَعْمِلْ مِنَ الصَّالِحَاتِ مِنْ ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنْثَى وَهُوَ مُؤْمِنٌ. Again, the same type is similar theme is mentioned. Those will enter paradise and will not be wronged even as much as the speck of a date seed. So there's this concept of equality between the genders, that each one of them is as worthy, and again we have this concept of nafs, and that's very interesting to see how nafs is and then the genders are. So for example, we have this verse which talks about huwa allazi khalaqakum min nafsin wahida. We've created you from a single self or a single soul. وَجَعَلَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا, and from it we've made its spouse. So, you know, and again, some people can there's a lot of interpretations to nafs wahida, which is kind of interesting on what that actually means, and you know, something perhaps to reflect. We then have this ayah in chapter 4 again, and some of the ulama use this to talk about changing sex or changing what Allah has created. So the verse goes, they call upon instead of him only females. They call upon nothing but a defiant Satan. Allah has cursed them and said, I will most surely take to themselves a due share of your servants, and I will most surely lead them astray and fill them with their fancy, and will most surely command them so that they most surely slit the ears of cattle, and most surely I will command them so that they will surely alter the creation of Allah. And that's the altering, which is highlighted there, which sometimes is taken as if you're altering what Allah has created for you, or altered how Allah has created us, then you know, some scholars see that as problematic. The other verse which talks about this is in chapter 30. So set your face upright towards the religion, faqumu wajhaka din hanifa, turning away from all that is false, the original disposition from Allah, fitrat Allah, allati fitrat an-nas alayha. Again, Allah's in this beautiful verse, Allah's talking about the fitra, that Allah, the original disposition that Allah has created, and then he says there cannot be any change. La yabdil li khalqillah, there cannot be any change in Allah's creation. ذَلِكَ الدِّينَ الْقَيِّمُ وَلَكِنْ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. This is the right way. This is the upright deen. But most of humankind is not aware. So again, you know, some verses talking about changing the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And perhaps one of my favorite verses, which has to do with gender identity, on the Quran talks about Sayyida Maryam, salam alayha. So says, so when she gave birth to her, she said, my Lord, indeed, I have given birth to a female. And then the response from Allah is, wa Allah aluma bima, was that Allah knows better what she delivered, right? So, and it's interesting why this is in the Quran. Why is it that Allah says, well, Allah knows better what has been delivered, is because Allah, in his infinite wisdom, when he creates us, he designates the sex for us, designates that, and he knows exactly what he is creating. And then again, this concept of there's a difference, and the male is not like the female. Walaysa az-zakar kal unsa. They're different. This very, very pronounced in this verse, that there's a difference between the two. And the beautiful naming of Sayyidah Maryam, for example, is in this verse. So hopefully, as we usually do, an analysis. I've done a little bit more of analysis today, since we have, inshallah, be looking at the Islamic lens. So in terms of an update, if you're joining the circle and you are maybe struggling with gender identity issues, and we have had people who have come to that, then the intent is to form a circle. At the moment, we do have circles for same-sex attraction, but we don't have circles for gender identity in particular. And of course, if there is a need for that, and we have had a few of you which have come, and if there's more of you that would like that, then please do come, and then inshallah we can start something. There's also a spouse circle, which there's been interest of spouses who are married to, and their other half is struggling with same-sex attraction. Again, we're hoping to start that as well. Next webinar, we're continuing the topic of gender identity. We have Brother Ayman Nassar, inshallah, from also from US, who by the way is also linking, I guess, to IFTCC, is also a signatory of the declaration. Some of you know what the declaration is. The declaration IFTCC is a multifaceted approach to safeguarding counseling for people who have either want to explore their sexual attractions, or when they want to explore their gender identity and they don't believe in an affirmative model, which just basically says, pushes one or prefers one sexual orientation over the other, which the affirmative model basically does, and says, well, there's nothing wrong with you, you're gay or you're transgender, and they coerce that identity upon you. So the declaration is there to protect explorative therapy. Inshallah, you can see it. The conference is in Hungary. We will be joined, inshallah, as last year, by Sheikh Fadl. Sheikh Fadl Suleiman would be coming. If you are interested in the conference in the IFTCC, it's a closed invitation. So you speak to us. We will, we'd love to have people from the community join us for that. And we're also thankful for Mike and the team from the IFTCC for having us in the conference as well. Right. So now to the more of the webinar. we're very grateful to have Dr. Sharif with us today. I personally saw the great presentation which he's done with Brother Paul Williams and Blogging Theology, and a really remarkable effort in opening this huge topic of sexuality and gender and in Islam. And because obviously we have a limited time, I've asked him to explore a little bit more about the gender identity, which has at least recently become more prominent, or is starting to become misunderstood in our own community. So I really recommend you to see the presentation if you haven't already on the channel. Is inshallah very, very useful. And Dr. Sharif, who joins us from Massachusetts, has an Arabic language qualification from Georgetown University and a Ph.D. in Islamic Studies from McGill University. His expertise lies in Islamic thought, on theology, law, fiqh. He is interested particularly in questions concerning relationship between reason and revelation in Islamic tradition. It's published on the fields of fiqh, Islamic fiqh, and Qur'anic tafsir. Doctor has also been interested within Islam and modernity. So obviously one of the things we're discussing today is gender identity and other such contemporary issues. So I'm so grateful. I hand over to the doctor who is with us. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. How are you, Brother Ali? It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me today.
Pleasure to have you.
Okay, so let's get started, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah, ashraf al-anbiya wal mursaleen, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. So I'm going to share my screen, if I may. Okay, so Brother Ali, as he said, because of the limited time, has asked me to discuss today the question of gender identity in Islam. Of course, this is part of a larger discussion when we say, homosexuality and transgenderism. The current acronym that is used is LGBT, LGBTQ. Of course, there are different permutations on that. And so what I've done is I've actually taken a selection of the slides that I used for the presentation that Brother Ali mentions, that I did with Paul Williams on Blogging Theology in June. And I've taken a selection of slides that deal with gender identity specifically. And we will go through those and concentrate on them today. And what I'd like to do is sort of walk through the presentation, annotate the slides as we speak, and then after that, open the floor for questions and answers and discussion, inshallah. So without further ado, actually, Brother Ali already took some of the burden off my shoulders because he covered a number of the verses that I have on here, but it's no problem. We can look at them again and also maybe expand a little bit on them. So we start, as always, in the name of Allah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And whenever we discuss as Muslims, the fact that we're Muslims means that we discuss things primarily from within a worldview perspective that is based in the Quran and the Sunnah, right? As Muslims, we don't just come to topics willy-nilly from nowhere and start discussing them in the same language and using the same conceptual framework and the same terminology as everyone around us. We may or may not, but we need to actually critique that first and look at it. And we always have to go back to our sources. We have to go back to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said in the Quran, what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said, as has reached us through hadith and other methods by which the Sunnah has reached us. And from that, we build our perspective. We build our understanding of who our creator is. We build our understanding of who we are as human beings in general. We build our understanding of what this life is all about, where we're going after death, how we're supposed to live in this world, what the purpose of life is. All of these things we derive from, and we learn them from the revelation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to us. And as Allah says in the Quran, Allahu ya'lamu wa antum la ta'lamun. Allah knows and you do not know. And so, of course, Allah has also given us brains, He has given us intellect, He has given us our senses, and He has given us these various avenues for gaining knowledge, right? Through our senses, through our reason. But in addition to those sources of knowledge, He has gifted humanity ever since the very beginning, ever since the very first human, Adam alayhi salam, who was also a prophet. Allah has always sent messengers throughout history to remind people and to teach them that which they would not know, and to show them the correct way to live and the correct way to understand the universe in which they have been created according to how it actually is. And so we derive our entire perspective, both in terms of how we see the world and ourselves, and also how we attempt to live in the world, ultimately from the ultimate source of guidance, which is the revelation that Allah has granted to us out of His wisdom and out of His generosity and His largesse. And so when it comes to the issue that we're talking about today, which is about the male and the female, just like any other issue, we go to the sources of revelation and we ask ourselves, what, if anything, have Allah and His Messenger said about these issues, right? And so we find that if we go to the Quran, that there are actually a number of verses that deal directly with the question of gender. And I'll go through them quickly because Brother Ali, mashallah, already went through them. And so we have the first verse, وَمَا خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى, and Allah is swearing. It's a series of swears at the beginning of Surah Al-Layl, and He swears among, when Allah swears, وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ, He always swears by something which is very substantial, something which is very significant, a significant part of His creation that He deems worthy of, being taken by Him as an oath in order to reinforce whatever point He is going to make after the series of oaths in a given verse. And so in Surah Al-Layl, we find in verse number 3 that Allah swears by His creation of the male and the female. وَمَا خَلَقَ, the ma is not negative here, it's a ma mastariyah. It makes a mastar or a verbal noun with the khalaqa. So وَمَا, the wa is like wallahi, by, and by His creation of the male and the female, by the fact that He created the male and the female, right? So we have this, Allah here underlining the importance of His creation, first of all, not just of human beings, but of the male and the female. In other words, He created human beings as two discrete, distinct types, right? We are a sexually dimorphic species. We exist as males and females normatively, and we'll talk about, there are some cases in which a person's gender might be undefinable or indefinite or unclear at birth for various medical reasons, but we'll get to that. But the normative base starting point is that Allah has created the male and the female. And then He says also in Surah Al-Najm, Surah number 53, وَأَنَّهُ خَلَقَ الزَّوْجَيْنِ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى. We also saw this with Brother Ali, and that He created the two mates. Who are the two mates? The male and the female, right? So here we have again this idea of the male and the female, and the idea that they were created in order to come together as pairs. Allah created them in order to be paired up with each other, right? He didn't create males to be paired with other males or females to be paired with other females, at least not in the way that He created males and females to be paired together, right? So there's a special, this is obvious, except we live in a time and place where these most basic kind of givens of human nature and givens of just the way the universe is created have been thrown into massive confusion. And actually, you have people with PhDs and a great deal of intelligence claiming that, they don't understand what gender is, or that it's just this socially constructed category, or that there's no reality to it. And this is part of a larger issue, part of larger trends that have been gaining steam in the Western world, particularly since the 1950s, 1960s, and even more so, right? And it's affected many, many different aspects of thought. It's brought about a sort of generalized relativism within culture, this idea that there is no truth, there is no reality. All there is projection. We just project either individually I, you, he, she. We just project individually what we think onto the world and how we read and interpret the world, or we do so as a species, or we do so as collectivities, you know, men or women or rich people or poor people or people from a certain country, whatever it may be. But there really is no kind of reality out there. It's an anti-realist position, right? And we are just free to kind of project our own interpretation onto the world. And this, it's important to understand that, because this idea that gender is not real, or that gender is somehow subjective, or that there is no objective reality to gender, right? Or that, okay, maybe we have physical sex, which is biological, but then gender identity is something that is just totally separate from that, right? All of this comes from a larger paradigm which applies this kind of subjectivism to many, many other aspects of life, right? So it's not specific to gender, right? It's not like the West has this view that, okay, there's an objective reality out there in so many different ways, and then gender, we make an exception. This is actually part of a much larger trend that has been, again, gaining steam over the last, say, 50, 60, 70 years, and that has really infected, you know, so much of thought and of culture. And we are seeing one of the most obvious manifestations of it now in the realm of gender. And this is one of the most troubling ones, because, again, when it comes to gender, it's so basic, right? It's so basic that when you start questioning some of the most basic, taken for granted categories that are universal, right? This has a potential to be extremely destabilizing in terms of society and also in terms of individuals, right? And we see more and more people, and we'll get to, I mean, obviously there is something called gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder. This is real, right? There really are people who deal with a profound discomfort with the body in which they were born, in which Allah created them, and a strong identification of themselves with the other sex. This is a real condition, right? And we're not denying that. It's absolutely real. But this condition is a relatively, affects a relatively small number of people. And what we see over the last 10 years, and particularly the last 5 or 6 years, is a burgeoning of a sort of very public transgender movement, which now has many, many people, many, many more times than before, just claiming that, okay, I'm non-binary, or I don't really have a gender, or I'm gender fluid, or one day I'm a male and one day I'm a female, or one day I identify as a man, one day I identify as a woman. And these are people who, in another world, I mean, like the world of 12 years ago, rather than 7 years ago or 8 years ago, it would never have crossed their minds, for most of these people, if they're a male, to think that they could wake up one day and sort of try on a different gender identity. I mean, this whole idea is completely new. And because the paradigm is there, people sort of buy into it. And they say, oh, well, if gender is fluid, well, maybe I can just be a different gender today, right? So this has gone way, way, way beyond what I would call like the actual sort of authentic cases, if we can say, of people who are, much beyond their own sort of control or their own choice. They are affected by a condition of this sort of profound dysphoria, right? This goes way beyond that to kind of, to sort of, as I said before, spread throughout a much larger number of people in society, I guess we could say it that way, right? And so to point out something like verses in which Allah says, and that He created the two mates, the male and the female, right? This was something like, was just obvious to most human beings until literally a few minutes ago, where Allah says, oh, and one of the signs are the alternation of the night and the day. You don't have to convince anyone that there's nighttime and daytime, and that these are contrasted with each other, and that one folds into the other, and so on and so forth. This is obvious. And Allah is pointing it to say, well, who did that? Who created the world thus? It is He, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, therefore worship Him. And these verses, are really meant, it seems, in the same spirit. This is not necessarily meant to establish the fact that there's a male and a female. It's so obvious that it doesn't need to be established, right? Allah is simply pointing to the obvious fact as one more sign of His greatness, of His majesty, of His glory, of His creation, and so forth. And then, as we also heard with Brother Ali, and the male is not like the female. So we'll see in the next slide, men and women, of course, are alike in many fundamental aspects. They're alike in being creatures of Allah. They're like in being human beings. They're like in the fact that they had the ruh blown from Allah into them. They are like in the fact that they have the task of carrying the moral charge of Allah on earth, which is the khilafah, that they are charged to be stewards of the earth, to be vicegerents of the earth, to exist in a moral realm, to do the good and eschew the evil, and to work towards the good pleasure of their Lord, and inshallah, with His mercy, paradise in the hereafter, right? Men and women are the same in this respect, but there are other respects in terms of physiology, overall, in terms of psychology, in terms of roles in society and so forth, where men and women are actually different, because again, they were created intentionally to be different and to be complementary and not to be the same, right? And again, this is something that is denied, vehemently denied by current society, at least in the West, right? That there should be any differences or distinctions between men and women at all. And whenever such differences are found, just like anything else, just like gender itself, these are chalked up to so-called, social constructionism and so on and so forth. And again, there's always an element of truth to most positions that gain prominence, right? Are there aspects of gender that are socially conditioned and culturally contingent? There are, and we'll talk about those. But does that mean that there are no differences whatsoever, no natural kind of inborn, whether physiological or otherwise, differences between men and women? Of course not. Again, it's something that everyone sort of knows, but no one's allowed to say, right? It's obvious to anybody, but it's taboo to actually state that, because it goes against a very kind of powerful and very jealous ideology, which is dedicated to the denial of any type of natural differences between men and women, regardless of how much that flies in the face of just obvious empirical evidence. And by that, I just mean our lived experience in the world, not even talking about, specialized scientific evidence. All of that is forthcoming as well. I mean, there is substantial evidence that has shown differences, inherent differences between men and women on many different factors and many different scales. And then we see the verse, and of His signs is that He created you for you from yourselves mates, that you may find tranquility in them, and He placed between you affection and mercy. Indeed, in that are signs for people who reflect. So again, this idea of mates, and that Allah created the male for the female for the male, and placed between them loving kindness, mawadda, and rahma, right? This is what is meant to characterize their relationship, the special relationship that they join together in order to bring about new life, to found a family, and to bequeath, basically, extend the human species and raise the following generation. And then at the very beginning of Surah An-Nisa, which we hear this in the khutbah practically every Friday, O mankind, fear your Lord, who created you from one soul and created from it its mate, right? So the first soul, and then from it its mate. So again, we're starting with these two mates, a male and a female, and dispersed from both of them, this one first male and the first female, Adam and his spouse, may Allah be pleased with them both, right? Dispersed from them many what? Men and women, right? Again, the category of men and women. So it's very fundamental, this gender binary, which is this, supposed to be like a swear word today, gender binary, is very fundamental to reality as Allah has created it, right? It's very much a part of the fabric of existence. And Allah here is bringing attention to that and reinforcing that, and showing how this is a sign of His creation. And then other verses, men and women in the Quran, we said men and women are the same when it comes to their moral duty and their moral capabilities, and their carrying of or being charged with the vicegerency, the khilafah. And so there's a famous verse from Surah Al-Ahzab where 10 different actions of righteous people are mentioned, and each one is mentioned specifically in the masculine form and in the feminine form. In Arabic, of course, in English, we don't distinguish. We just say those who, but in Arabic, innal muslimina wal muslimat, right? Wal mu'minina wal mu'minat. So the masculine and the feminine, men who submit and women who submit, men who have faith and women who have faith, men who are obedient and women who are obedient, men who are truthful and women who are truthful, men who are steadfast and women who are steadfast, men who humble themselves to Allah and women who humble themselves to Allah. men who give alms and women who give alms, men who fast and women who fast, men who guard their chastity and women who guard their chastity, men who remember Allah much and women who remember Allah much. For them has Allah prepared forgiveness and a mighty reward. So we see this beautiful list of qualities, and these are all moral and spiritual qualities, right? Submission, faith, obedience to Allah, truthfulness, steadfastness, humility. I'm just reading through again, generosity in the giving of alms, fasting, guarding one's chastity and modesty, and remembering much Allah, engaging much in the remembrance of Allah, right? So these are beautiful qualities that ennoble the human being, right? It is through doing these types of things and engaging in these kinds of behaviors and attitudes and cultivating them in our hearts and in our lives that we become truly human beings in the way that Allah has intended by ennobling. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, Allah says that we've ennobled the descendants of Adam. He has made us noble, right? Partially by virtue of our physical shape and our physical form, but more so in terms of our intellect and in terms of our hearts, the qalb, and in terms of the spirit that He's blown into us, and in terms of the fact that we have the ability to cultivate virtue and to reach moral, to reach moral heights and realize moral integrity in our lives. This is what makes, and to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to worship Him consciously, because Allah says in the Quran that there's nothing except that it sings the praises of Allah. وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ. There's nothing except that it is hymning the praises of Allah. But everything else in creation, with the exception of the jinn, they do so by their very nature. They don't have a choice in the matter, right? The bees and the birds and so on, they're making tasbih, but it's involuntary. It's just purely natural to them. It's purely spontaneous. But for human beings, we have been given this great opportunity, but also this great risk that we can choose to either submit to Allah and worship Him and cultivate virtue, or we can rebel against Allah as Shaitan did and those who follow him. And we can reject Allah, and we can turn away from Him, and we can follow our own desires and our own wishes and our own ideas and our own beliefs and so forth, right? And so this is the challenge that Allah has placed upon us. And then we have another verse, tell the believing men and believing women are allies of one another. They enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. Again, so a moral quality here that they both, moral action that they both are engaged in. And they establish prayer and give zakat and obey Allah and His Messenger. Those, Allah will have mercy upon them. Indeed, Allah is exalted in might and wise. So here we have two verses that show sort of the parity between men and women. And then another one, whoever works righteousness, man or woman, and has faith, verily to him will we give a new life, a life that is good and pure, and we will bestow on such their reward according to the best of their actions. And then we have two verses here that show now a contrast, right? Where men and women are given different roles and duties, broadly speaking, when it comes to the task in which their differences are most relevant and the reasons for which the differences exist, which is reproduction in the building of a family and the building of a home, right? And so in this domain, Allah says, men are the hawamun, protectors and maintainers of women, because God has given the one more than the other, and because they support them from their means. So there's obviously a lot of tafsir on this verse, and we don't have time to get into it, right? But the idea here is that in principle, men are given the duty to support the household financially, right? And they are given a element of authority in order to establish the household and in order to run it in a wise way and in order to protect and be in charge of the inhabitants of the household. That is a duty that Allah has given to men specifically by virtue of the fact that He has made them such and society exists as such that, again, things have changed very recently, but in most times, in most places, men are the ones who earn the money and bring it home, and they're the ones that are charged specifically with spending on the family. And the reasons for this are very obvious. Women often spend time pregnant and nursing children and taking care of young children and so forth. And today we take for granted that we can sit at desks behind computers and do jobs and things like that. And, even as early as Karl Marx in the early 19th century, he said technology will flatten out the differences between men and women, right? And this has happened, and that's partially why there is so much commotion, I think, when it comes to issues of gender. And people start saying, well, what is a male and what is a female? I mean, no one could have asked this question in previous times because it was just obvious. And the way life was set up is just the differences were quite pronounced. And the complementarity between the two was very obvious to everybody. And I often say, if you imagine times in the past where, life expectancy was in fact much shorter, there were high rates in many places of infant mortality and so forth. Women would often be pregnant maybe 4 or 5, I mean, not even 4, that'd be small, 6, 7 times, and to think that while doing this, a woman is also like working as much as a man and feeding herself and support, it makes no sense, right? So Allah says, no, I mean, that's not her job to do that because it's too much of a burden. And so the man who is the one whose children she's actually having, he's in charge of taking care of her and of taking care of the children, right? And today we bristle at that, like, oh, that's sexism and that's, gender normative and whatever, blah, blah, blah. But if you just, take a step back from our cultural moment and just look at the realities of human life outside of this kind of very artificial technocratic society that we've developed very recently, right? This is something which in it, there's a great deal of mercy. Technically speaking, in Islam, a woman does not at any time of her life have to support her own self, right? Until she gets married, she has her father's responsibility. He must spend on her by law, right? He cannot tell her, you're 20 years old, go get a job, and support yourself. He cannot do that. In an Islamic system, he could be taken to court and forced to support her because it's not her duty. And when she gets married, her husband has that duty. And if she gets divorced, then she goes back to, not necessarily physically back to, but her father, again, or nearest brother or whatever, would be technically responsible for spending on her, right? And this is something which I don't think you find in any other system, but the idea is that that is a right that Allah has given to women, and it's not a right that Allah has given to men, right? So there are differential rights, differential duties. And as we see in the last verse here, and women shall have rights similar to the rights against them, according to what is equitable, but men have a degree over them, and God is exalted in power and wise. And again, there's a lot of talk about and that men have a degree above. There's a lot of discussion about what this means. Again, we cannot go into the details here, but the idea is that there's a complementarity here between men and women. Okay, other differences, because we want to get into specifically, what happens when people fall outside of this binary and so forth and don't identify with this and are dealing with a lot of turmoil on account of that. So let's just go quickly here. Difference in complementarity. I've already actually mentioned most of this before between the man and the woman. We've seen the male is not like the female. There's the obvious complementarity between male and female in the bodies and the reproductive systems. And we would understand as Muslims, right, that this purpose isn't, there's a purpose that's inherent to our body and its functions as created by God, right? It's not for us to decide. Again, we said, this is not this idea that there's just a blank slate out there of meaningless matter, right? And that we just popped onto the scene through pure chance, through, evolution that got started, God knows how, no pun intended, right? And here we are, and then there's really no meaning except for what we project on it. This is a purely secular and materialistic way of looking at things. Muslims and even Christians and Jews and others, and even the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, anyone before the modern Western world, basically the worldview that grew up in the modern West, everybody looked at the universe as being teleological, meaning looked at it as having an inherent purpose, right? There was a purpose out there. We were to discover it. We were to live according to it. We were to try to find out what it was. But it's not just we don't have the sovereign power to just kind of assign meaning to things. And the idea that we can do that, again, is very much at the heart of what we're dealing with today, just in the larger culture, right? Well, I can just do whatever I want with my body. Well, who said? Well, my body has no meaning. My sex organs have no meaning. They're just mine, and I can just do whatever with them, whatever I want. the idea that no, okay, they have a nature, they have a purpose. It's clear that the purpose of the male and the female are, to pair together. And the idea that it could be inherently immoral, right, or morally reprehensible to use one's body that has been created in a way that is at odds with its intrinsic purpose, right, is just completely off the table. For most people in the modern world, it sounds crazy because they don't understand the world as having any kind of inherent purpose, because they don't see it by and large as having been created by a creator, right? I mean, I'm not saying there are not people who believe in God and believe in these things in the modern world, but the modern world as such, sort of the public face of it and the public discourse of it does not at all recognize anything of the sort. And because of that, that worldview, as it develops, it impinges more and more and more and more. And that's why you see, a sharp decrease of faith in Europe, less so in America, but, America is just a step or two behind, right? Because this worldview is just, it's channeled through everything, through the education system, through the media, through everything, right? And so it comes to really have a very strong effect on the way people see the world around them, okay? I don't want to dwell too much on this because of the time. Complementarity and disposition between men and women. We talked about this. The idea that fathers and mothers are not interchangeable. Children need both. Both bring something different to the table. And religious rules for men, others for women. We talked a little about that. And again, empirical evidence, not only what's obvious to people just from our lived experiences, but also, technical studies that have been done have shown, all sorts of differences between men and women physiologically, which is obvious, but also psychologically, dispositionally, and so forth. Although, again, it's very taboo to kind of speak in these terms because the current ideology holds that, again, any type of difference is just purely, quote unquote, socially constructed, which means that they're not real, they're not inherent, they're not given, they're just something that we sort of have constructed. And because we've constructed them, no one remembers how or when, but because the idea is because we've constructed them as a society, we can deconstruct them and reconstruct them however we want, right? And that's the assumption that drives the facility with which people in the contemporary world, particularly in the West, can just, accept ideas like, oh, sure, yeah, gender is just a construct. Let's just deconstruct it. Let's deconstruct the patriarchy. Let's deconstruct this and that, and let's just reconstruct it anew however we want, with no consequences, because they don't see that they're violating any kind of natural given inherent purpose or teleology or anything like that. They just think it's this kind of meaningless stuff that's just floating around that we are at liberty to kind of do whatever we want with and to impart whatever meaning to, right? And this is diametrically opposed to the perspective from which we would be coming at this as Muslims, right? So moving along then, if we get to some principles of gender in Islam, and we've touched on these key Islamic principles, are that there are two, right? There are two genders, the male and the female. The scholars, ever since very early on, have recognized that some people, as I mentioned in the beginning, are born with ambiguous sex, meaning biologically ambiguous, where the sex organs are not fully developed, and where it can actually be ambiguous just by looking at the newborn, whether it is a male or a female, right? A person for whom this is the case is known in Arabic as a khuntha, which today they call it intersex. They used to call it hermaphrodite from two Greek gods, right? Hermes, who's a male, and Aphroditus, who's female. Anyway, so hermaphrodite was like both the male and the female. I don't know their story and why they chose those two to name such a person, but anyway. So the idea is that, even with the khuntha, right, this is very important here, the scholars never said that this was a third sex. They said this is someone whose gender is ambiguous. We don't know if this person is a male or a female, but they're one or the other. We just don't know which one. And they came up with many different ways, according to their own knowledge and technology of the time, the scientific knowledge, of how to see whether, they are dominated by male traits or dominated by female traits. So they said, well, where do they urinate from? If it's more frontal, it's male. If it's a little bit more behind, it's a female. And then if that can't tell, well, what about when they reach puberty? Do they start to develop male secondary characteristics or female? Do they start to grow breasts? Things like this, right? So the idea is that this person is a male or female, we just don't know which one. Today, we know that there are some cases, very rare, where you have XXY or XYY. So even chromosomally speaking, there are people who don't have just an XX or an XY, right? And you can find information on this in the article that was done by Brother Mubin Vayed and Brother Wahid Jensen. It's called Gender, and the male is not like the female, gender nonconformity in Islam. And you'll see at the end of the slide presentation, I have the resources. There's a part 1 and a part 2, and the part 2 is a fabulous, study of the entire modern transgender movement from the mid-20th century until today, as well as a review of medical, especially in one of the appendices. There's a review of all of the kind of intersex conditions that are known about today, and it tells you exactly what they are and how frequent they are and what the effects of them are and what they are constituted of. So I refer you to that article for more specific information on this. The notion which came up around the mid 80s was popularized that there's this major distinction between biological sex and psychological gender, right? That my sex is my body, but my gender is whatever's in my head, right? For most people, most times and places, these are pretty much interchangeable because for most people, they line up. If, people with male bodies are men and they identify themselves as men and see themselves as men, and women, the same for women. People with female bodies are women and they see themselves as women. Again, there is a small number of people for whom this is not the case, right? We talked about this a little bit earlier, but the idea is that from a normative perspective, right, this distinction is not made systematically, right? So in other words, although for some people there might be a misfit, right, or a disjuncture here, that does not mean that the conjunction is not something that normative or something that is, in most cases, except, for these exceptions, is something that, to be kind of taken for granted. And today we have a hypersensitivity about, okay, sex is one thing and gender is something totally separate. Sex is the body, gender is in the mind. And gender is, and when the two conflict, right, here's the key. Well, which should take priority? If the two conflict, do I give priority to the body and say, well, if you have a female body, you're a female, like you're a woman. If you don't think you are, well, okay, well, that's a different question, but you really are a woman, right? Or do we say, no, the body doesn't really matter. It's really the mind that matters. It's the psyche that matters. And if I feel like if I have a female body, but I feel like I'm a man, well, then I don't just feel like I'm a man. I am a man, because to be a man or a woman is not about any objective physical reality to begin with. It just is a psychological disposition, right? I mean, that's a definitional question. Depends on that's a metaphysical question, actually, right? What is a woman? That documentary that just came out earlier in the summer, Matt Walsh, right? What is a woman? If you haven't seen that, it's very instructive. He goes around asking all these people with PhDs, professors, doctors, and they cannot answer the question, or they will not answer, in America and Europe. When he goes to Africa, people are like, why are you even asking this? And they're all confused as to, how someone could be asking the question with a straight face. Anyway, so moving along. So we also know another principle in Islam, that deliberate imitation of the opposite sex is prohibited by several clear hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and specifically in dress and affectations. And we need to talk about this because we have to be very clear what we're saying and what we're not saying. So there is a hadith in Bukhari that the Messenger of God ﷺ has cursed men who deliberately imitate women, and women who deliberately imitate men. Now I put deliberately here, I added it in quotation marks because the Arabic says, La'ana Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the Messenger has cursed those who al-mutashabbihina min al-rijali bin-nisa' wal-mutashabbihati min al-nisa'i bil-rijal. And this form of the word tashabbaha doesn't just mean to resemble, it means to deliberately resemble. I mean, it means that verb tashabbaha, it means to consciously and deliberately take on the characteristics of something. like you say, ta'amraka, like he became Americanized, or tafarnasa, became Frankified or something, okay? So tashabbaha bin nisa means to willfully and deliberately kind of make oneself resemble women if one is a man, or to make oneself resemble men if one is a woman. So how can one, do this deliberately? Clearly, and we'll talk about mannerisms and things like that in the next slide, because that's very important. But Al-Bukhari himself, he actually puts this hadith in his book, the Sahih al-Bukhari. It's arranged according to topic. So he arranges it, he groups the hadith into various topics, and he puts this hadith under the Bab al-Libas, which is the chapter on dress, meaning that he understands this, and the scholars understand this, to be specifically addressing things that people have control over. You can always control how you dress. I may or may not be able to control my laugh or my speech or my hand movements or something like that, or my gait, meaning my walk, right? And we'll come to that. But, and there's a discussion about that, if one has mannerisms that are atypical for one's gender, what does that mean and how do we deal with that? But when it comes to something like dress, right, that's something that we can clearly control and choose. And so he puts it in there to show that what is really meant here is a deliberate imitation, and not just the fact that someone happens to be maybe less typical within their gender in terms of their mannerisms or whatever else, and they might be closer to the other gender. It's not talking about that. It's talking about deliberately taking on aspects of the other, okay? Gender transitioning also is something that is not recognized, because we have seen that Allah's created the male and the female, and when there is that disjuncture, then that is something that we need to deal with as best as we can, and we can talk more about that. But to go to the extent of saying, well, I reject the fact that I am a man or I am a woman as I've been created, and I want to actually change my body into the opposite, is not something. First of all, you can't change your sex. I mean, you cannot physically do that. You can only make yourself superficially resemble the other sex, but you cannot change your actual sex when we're talking here about the biological fact of it, right? Every single cell in your body is encodes you as a male or a female, X or XY. Small, rare conditions where there's sometimes XXY and so forth, right? And nothing you can do will ever change that, right? And when we've seen that it is, not prohibited, it's not permitted even to dress like the opposite sex, what about going beyond that and physically, permanently changing one's body to resemble the other sex? That's like a much, much more serious degree of it. And not only that, but it says here chemical, so that's about what they call sartorial, transformation. Sartorial meaning how you dress, or social transformation. Okay, I'm just going to start dressing like a woman and taking on a woman's name. Okay, that's already forbidden by the hadith. And so if that's true, then a fortiori, right, and babi awla, things like chemical and surgical so-called reassignment procedures, right, are prohibited as a form of mutilation and unlawfully, quote unquote, changing the creation of God, right? La tabdila li khalqillah. We saw that with Brother Ali. There is no change in, right, the creation of God. And specifically, in these kind of physical, the way Allah has created us. And also, so-called reassignment procedures always involve what by Islamic law would be considered mutilation. So it's not permissible to remove or to alter functioning healthy parts of your body, right? To remove healthy breasts or to remove genitalia if you're male. This is prohibited to do this, right? And you could say, well, didn't they have eunuchs in the Ottoman? Well, that's history has many things. It's not our guide, right? Castrating males so that they can be in charge of, the imperial harem or something. That's not permissible to do that, right? In the verse in the Quran that Brother Ali read, where the shaitan says, وَلَا أَمُرَنَّهُمْ فَلَيُغَيِّرُنَّ خَلْقَ اللَّهِ, I will command them and they will change the creation of Allah. This is about branding cattle on their ears, like with a mark. So that's like fairly tame compared to what these kinds of procedures entail. And Allah is saying that even that was inspired by Satan, that they would even brand the ears of cattle. So what about, removing healthy, functioning reproductive organs from human beings, right? This is how the perspective that we have to see this, right? Okay, so now what about those who fall outside of this binary? Like we said, the normativity of the male-female binary, and I've mentioned several times that people can fall outside of this, both in terms of sexual attraction, which is, what most of the conversation has been about in the last couple of decades: homosexuality, same-sex attraction, same-sex marriages and relationships. And in fact, my talk with Brother Paul was mostly about that, because that's kind of the head topic, and gender identity is folded in with that, but it's become much more prominent over the last decade, and that's the topic that we're focusing on this evening. So what about those who fall outside of the binary, right? We said before that sex, gender identity and expression, and sexual orientation should line up as a normative matter, meaning if you're born with a male body, then it's normative that you would identify as a male and that you would be attracted to females and engage with them romantically and sexually. And if you're a female, the opposite, right? That's normative, and we're not apologetic about that as Muslims. People say, well, that's heteronormative, and it's, well, fine. You can call it whatever you want. I mean, those are just words that people make up, and they sort of fling them around as terms of abuse, but it is what it is, right? Again, we're not denying that that real life is more complicated than this, but we have to have a paradigm from which we're operating, right? And in terms of which we can assimilate and deal with the messiness of everyday life, right? But from within a larger normative paradigm. And in the modern world, the normative paradigm is gone, so everything is just slipping and sliding all the time with no fixed point of reference. And this is a big problem. And this is something that we as Muslims, have the possibility of escaping if we hold on to what we've been given. As Allah says, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, and hold on tight, all of you, to the rope of Allah, and do not separate, right? So exceptions to the rule do not undermine the rule itself, namely the normativity of male-female gender binary, the expectation of broad conformity to the behavioral norms of one's natal sex and gender. We'll get into a little bit more detail on this. Opposite sex attraction, and within Islamic legal bounds, sexual expression, meaning, sexual expression, to the extent that it occurs, has to be within Islamically defined boundaries, and those are always of necessity heterosexual. Okay, now the big question here: am I sinful for feeling attracted to my own sex, right, or not identifying with my own gender? Well, what if I'm a female and I really hate my female body, and I hate getting my period, and I really feel like I'm a boy, or a man and I really feel like I'm a woman? Am I sinful for having these feelings, merely for having the feelings? And so a key principle we always have to keep in mind in Islam is that one is morally responsible only for what one has control over, right? So to the degree to which such feelings are something that someone experiences, that impact them, that they don't, necessarily choose or cultivate on their own, one is not morally. It's like, okay, I'm depressed. Am I morally responsible for being depressed? No. Right? How do you deal with it? Right? You're responsible for not harming yourself. You're responsible for not committing suicide. You're responsible for not going out and getting addicted to alcohol as a way to deal with your depression, right? And you're responsible for how you deal with it, but you're not responsible necessarily for the, just being subject to some kind of condition, whether it's related to gender and sexuality or anything else, right? This is just a general principle, okay? So merely experiencing same-sex attractions or gender identity disorder/dysphoria does not constitute a sin, right? Hopefully that's clear to people, but it's always good to make it, explicit, because some people might think that they're sinful just for feeling, atypical about their gender identity or about their sexual orientation or attractions, right? And it's important to be clear that that's not the case. So, and as we said, we're still responsible for our actions. specifically from refraining, in our context here, from haram sexual behavior, right, as in engaging, for example, with a member of the same sex in a sexual relationship, or deliberate imitation or impersonation of the opposite sex, okay? Let's skip the genderbread person for now. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about, and then we'll end and hopefully open up for discussion in our last 20 minutes or so. Gender nonconformity in Islam, what do we mean when we say, broad norms of one's gender and not deliberately imitating? We talked about dress, but what else comes into this? And I think that, if you go into the literature of our scholars over the centuries, I'm not talking about just today because this is a big topic, our scholars have dealt with this. There's a lot of discussions on this in certain places that you can find, right? And the scholars have recognized that there is a component that is urfi or conventional regarding what counts as male or female dress and behavior in a specific time and place, okay? So obviously every culture will have different norms as to what is, how people dress in general. And then within that, they will have norms as to how men in general dress and how women dress. And what's interesting is whatever the norms are, right, however much they change from society to society, you almost always find that there is some type of distinction between males and females. Like, again, it's just inherent because we're created this way. So even in these, some indigenous tribes or whatever, they're practically naked, I mean, usually like women will have a little bit more than the men. Men have a loincloth, women have a little bit more, or men have nothing and women have a loincloth or whatever. I mean, there's like usually some difference, okay? And then you go to other societies where people dress more and then the styles change and all of that. And they can change from time to time. And I said it in my other presentation, in the 200 years ago in the United States, men would wear, like George Washington, these big wigs with this like long curly hair, and they have these big ruffly blouses and tights. Right? All of this for us is very feminine in our day and age, right? But in their time, that was normal for men. So they were not considered, if they were Muslim, they would not have fallen under what the hadith is forbidding, because that was male dress in their time. Okay. And if you look at what females dressed like in their time, it's very different, right? They had those big poofy dresses and the, what do you call it? The bodices and all of that stuff, right? Okay. So they didn't dress the same. They dressed distinctly. Now, a man at that time who took off the wig and the frilly thing and put on one of those dresses, now that would be haram. I mean, if they were Muslim, right? That's cross-dressing, that's imitating the opposite sex. For a woman to say, I'm going to wear those tights and the whatever, okay, now she's imitating a man. So she would fall under the hadith, right? So there is a component, but the idea is whatever is normative within your society and seen as being clearly the dress or the behavior of the opposite sex, right, as defined by your society, that is what one should, avoid, right? And that intention also. When it comes to mannerisms, and I think this is important for a lot of people, scholars recognize that a person can have gender atypical mannerisms, gait, voice, etc. Okay, and if it's a male who has more effeminate mannerisms, there's a name for this. It's called mukhannath, which is related to the word khuntha, which we saw earlier, which is the intersex person. It's the same root, but it's not the same form of the verb. So mukhannath is a male, the traditional word for a male with effeminate mannerisms. And for a woman with more masculine mannerisms, you'll find in the literature mudhakkara, right? So she has sort of male characteristics, okay? And these mannerisms, scholars understood, could be either what they call khilqi, which means they're kind of part of a person's constitutional makeup and are, what's the word? Involuntary, or they are ghair khilqi, non-constitutional, non-dispositional, which means they're affected, i.e. taken on deliberately, right? So they distinguish those, right? Now, if they are affected or non-dispositional, non-natural to the person, then there is consensus that this is haram, because we said, that's the tashabbuh. And the hadith says that the Prophet, peace be upon him, has cursed men who deliberately imitate women and women who deliberately imitate men. So if it's being done deliberately, this is clearly haram by consensus, right? But as for those for whom such mannerisms, atypical mannerisms, are khilqi or dispositional to them, the scholars here actually differed. Some of them said that the person should try to recondition himself. For example, a male with a very effeminate laugh or voice or gait or hand movements or whatever, right? He should at least try to recondition himself to be more typical to his gender, expression according to the more typical male behavior, right? And that if he tries to, so that he would be sinful if no effort is even made, right? But he would be blameless if reasonable efforts are made, but to no avail. So if the person tries, that reasonably and can't really, it's just too ingrained in them, they can't really change, or it takes a great deal of effort or whatever. But they've tried and they can't do it, then those scholars would say, okay, they were blameless. But if the person doesn't try, then he or she would be blameless for not even trying. That's one view. The other view was that there's no obligation to even attempt reconditioning as long as it's not something that a person took on willfully. Again, you're only responsible for what you have control over and what you choose, right? That is a moral thing. And so also we build on this that it's actually haram to mock a person for having atypical mannerisms. And there's a specific hadith where if you call a man, specifically a muhannath, right, this is haram. And I think it's one of the early khulafa who actually had someone flogged for calling another man a muhannath or saying something that implied, in a derogatory manner that sort of made reference to a type of atypical behavior or something like that, right? It's considered haram to do that, right? So that's important to know. Interest in behavior, I would say that, Islam is not, again, male and female roles are defined to some degree by the Sharia. The male and female are the same in many respects, but different in many respects. Again, that's something we consider inherent and natural and God-given, right? But nevertheless, it's not super prescriptive when it comes to things like personal interests and likes. If a girl is more into typical boy things or a boy is more interested into typical girl things, this is not in and of itself, haram. And this is not what's meant by tashabbuh, right? That's not what it's meant. So if a boy has an interest in things that are more typical of a female or whatever, this is not in and of itself haram. Now, it might be problematic depending on larger circumstances. Okay, the boy just doesn't want to get out of his mommy and sisters and doesn't want to go with other boys. No, it's a problem. He needs to be introduced to the world of men. He needs to be part of that world, right? So if he's just doing all these female things as a way of, assimilating himself to women and avoiding the world of man and becoming a man, and so, no, that's a problem, right? But if it's a man who's integrated and just happens to have interests that are more, kind of typically female, or a girl the other way around, there's no problem in this, right? This is not something that's that is prescribed by the religion, or proscribed, right? Either one. And the Sunnah has many examples of things that we might in our current culture today consider not manly, right? Like men crying profusely. In Western culture, modern Western culture, it's kind of seen as unmanly for a man to cry. And the seerah is full of examples of, so-and-so cried until his beard was like soaking wet. And I mean, there's some mubalagha here, probably some exaggeration, but the idea is that we always have like many scenes of men crying and things like that, right? That's not considered inherently non-masculine, right? The Prophet, peace be upon him, was not above domestic tasks. We know that he darned his own socks and would sweep the floor and things like this. He didn't say, oh, that's woman's work and then at the Shabbat bin Nisad, like I'm not going to be like women. That's not what it's talking about, right? So we need to be clear and nuanced here. And as I mentioned in my last presentation, we don't have this, there's this kind of there was this Victorian notion of like this dainty, delicate, like fainting female, right? This damsel in distress. And I don't see this kind of stereotype if you look in Islamic, literature. Again, men and women are different dispositionally, but this kind of whole kind of hyped up image of this very, crystal doll is something that's specific to at least even certain times and places in the West, and even not even probably universal there, right? What counts as appropriate same-sex action is also largely conventional. As probably many people know, men in many Muslim cultures are very touchy-feely compared to the West. They'll walk around holding hands, hooking arms, kissing, and all of this. All of these behaviors in the West would be immediately interpreted as homosexual, right? Or putting, lying like on each other and all of these things. You just, in the West, there's like, especially for men, very, very little room for any type of socially acceptable physical interaction. That is a cultural norm, right? And it used to be different in the West. You can actually find pictures of men in the 19th century who are, taking public pictures where they're arms around each other and like leaning into each other and lying on each other, and all of these things that, like, you would see more in other societies today, but not in the modern West. And you look at them, you say, oh my God, all these guys, they look gay or whatever. And they would not, that was a time and place where that would have been extremely taboo for them to be seen as being openly homosexual. And the fact that they were doing this openly proves that that type of behavior was not interpreted as being unmanly or something like that, right? So there's a lot of element, a lot of the degree to which a lot of this is also culturally specific. However, there are clear Islamic guidelines that transcend culture, right? And this all goes back to the Sharia, things like the prohibition of seeing or touching the aura of someone of the same sex, lying naked together under one sheet. Sometimes people do share beds, and again, a lot of places people are traveling, you don't have, like, it's not actually forbidden to share a bed, but you would have to be dressed because, for obvious reasons, right? It can be dangerous to be unclothed, and things can happen even if one's not specifically, same-sex oriented or whatever. The point is you always have to take precautions. The intersex, as we've talked about, the junta is not a new phenomenon. It's dealt with rather extensively in works of FIP, and something like gender identity disorder, dysphoria. We would see this, right, as Muslims, we would see it as a psychological or an emotional condition, not as a third sex, and not as, for example, a woman trapped in a man's body or vice versa, right? We would say that there's a mismatch there. We should try to get to the bottom of it. We should try to help the person as much as possible, overcome those feelings of dysphoria, or learn to kind of live and cope with the body with which they've been created, and try to sort of bring more of an alignment with that, right? But this idea of which takes precedence, the body or the psyche, again, it's not permissible to change the body in order to conform to the psyche. So I guess if you had to come down on one side or the other, we'd probably say we would take the body to be kind of the baseline here, right? And that if the psyche is out of line with it, we need to try to bring the psyche back into line with it, rather than changing the body in impermissible ways. And again, you can go to the article that I mentioned before by Brother Mubin and Brother Wahid Jensen, where the statistics show some people will say, okay, I transitioned and it saved my life. And this is true for some people, but statistically speaking, the amount of depression afterwards and even suicidality is the same or higher than before. So from a statistical perspective, right? Statistics just means you're taking an average, right? It doesn't mean it's going to be true for every single person, but when you look at the statistical average, transitioning actually doesn't have any net benefit from a statistical perspective. And in fact, some of the indicators are even worse. And you've changed your body in near irreversible ways, right? Okay. So I want to probably very quickly, I'm not going to go through this. There are a lot of materials that are now available for us in our community. We know that there are people among Muslims who experience either unchosen same-sex attractions and or gender dysphoria. Islam doesn't categorize people on the basis of these internal feelings. They're Muslim like everybody else. And we always have to distinguish between feelings, particularly unchosen feelings on the one hand, and acts, right? And also between acts, even if one does acts, in kind of advocacy of the type that we see today by people who want to change the religion and force new norms and so forth. We need to, make clear distinctions between, these are three very separate things, okay? Muslims struggling faithfully within the religion with either same-sex attraction or gender identity disorder should be embraced and supported as mujahideen, right? Warriors in the path of Allah, because it's a difficult struggle that people are waging for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And so we have support groups like Straight Struggle now, some strong support, which is where we are today. And some resources I will go on. So I've mentioned before, the male is not like the female, Islam and gender nonconformities, part 1 and 2. Very important, I think, for this topic to go to those two parts there. And then also the second resource here, A Way Beyond the Rainbow, by brother Dr. Wahid Jensen. He's actually a medical doctor. 88 episodes, and there are, I think, 7 or 8 episodes that are specific to the topic of gender identity disorder specifically. And I'll get to those on a different slide. Also, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, Tim Winter, has several issues on gender. They're a bit dated, but I still think they're very good as a foundational read on Islamic approaches and understandings of gender and gender identity, also in light of current discussions in feminist circles and others. So you have the articles here. I can make the slides available as well so that you can have these resources. And then A Way Beyond the Rainbow podcast, 5 seasons. I won't go through this now, but the episodes that are relevant to gender identity disorder are all in season 5, which runs from episode 66 to 88. And there are how many here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So episode 68, Between Toxic Masculinity and Radical Feminism. This is a very good episode. And then the next, and then from 73 through 78, these are all, 1 hour, 1.5 hours typical on topics directly related to what we're speaking of today. So episode 73 on gender and gender nonconformity, on gender atypical individuals and intersex. So much more, detailed than what I was able to say here. And then 2 episodes back to back on gender dysphoria and transgenderism. First one dealing with medical perspectives, second one dealing with contemporary challenges. And then the last 2 on Shara'i perspectives, gender roles and gender nonconformity is one of them. And then gender transitioning and contemporary issues is another one. And those 2 are with Sheikh Mustafa Omar, who's actually been very, very good on this issue for a number of years. He lives in California in the United States. And so I'll stop there. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. I'm sorry if I went on too long. I have a tendency to do that. So I think we can still have time for some questions. I'm also happy to stay a little bit more.
Of course, no. Yes, no, thank you for what, alhamdulillah, very detailed, thorough, as you'd be aware of Dr. Sharif's presentation, mashallah, and there were so many things that I said, mashallah, so many moments, especially the distinction that the scholars have between khilki and ghair khalki, and how that mercy that exists within Islam that says, okay, if someone is, if that's within their nature, then perhaps that's within their nature, but they should try, and if they can't, then it's okay. And if it's ghair khalki, if they're affected by it, then of course, then there is room for improvement for them to, maybe they're struggling with it. And so I think that's beautiful that there's that distinction between what certain cultures, as you said, would have considered masculine, and now in terms of the clothing we're wearing, or in terms of how Africa might consider masculinity, or Europe might consider masculinity, or America might consider masculinity is different, and seeing that there's quite a range in that, and then Islam allows for that range as long as you're not intentionally, like you said, deliberately doing that. And I think there's that mercy in Islam, and you're absolutely right that we need to have a paradigm, that normative model, and you're absolutely right. People like say, oh, this normative or heteronormative, and it's like, well, or gender binary, these things have become swear words, where it's like, well, it's always like the minority. To appease the minority, you're going to completely eradicate what 99% are experiencing, and we kind of have that culture, unfortunately, where there is, like you say, there isn't that basis, and we're so lucky to have the guidance by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which has been passed by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So alhamdulillah, we have that. So yes, as Dr. Sharif has kindly said that he will stay on for Q&A. So for Q&A, you can raise your hand if you want to ask a question through the audio. Just be aware that your name will be displayed and this is live. So if you want a more anonymous approach, you can see the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, and you can put your question there. You can rate the questions as well, and inshallah we can get to it. So that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or if you wish to speak, you can raise your hand. One of the questions I had was going through some of the slides and listening to people who kind of having this gender identity issue is that if they have that from, say, a very young age, in which they have, maybe due to some family structures, disconnected from their own gender from a very young age, and they find it difficult to, when we even talk about male and female, that they find it difficult to sometimes understand what that sex means for them. So for example, if I'm a man and we talk about masculinity, then the word masculinity is very elusive for them, or they don't understand what it is other than stereotypes. How Islamically can we then approach such individuals, and how would we frame that if the actual sex or the word that we're using isn't something they, obviously we talk about nafs, we say, okay, I am myself, I know I have a nafs, but then when you talk about the representation of that nafs in terms of male and female, sometimes they say, well, actually I don't know. And obviously this is psychological, what I'm talking about. So how would you approach that with someone who has that confusion?
So I'm not a psychologist or, someone who is trained to actually do this, but my overall advice would be that you should always meet someone where they are, right? Everything we said, we're talking right now from sort of an objective kind of rational perspective, but which is good. We need to have that reference point. But when you're dealing with an individual who comes into your office or comes into your space, whether you're an imam or just a family member, whoever, obviously people come in with their own backgrounds, with their own baggage and things like that. And, you can have this whole structure in your mind, but you just kind of keep it in your mind and look at where are they from? Listen to the person first, right? What are their experiences? How do they feel towards gender, their gender in particular, or just gender in general? Why do they feel like that? Hear them out, give them a chance to express. What is it that they're uncomfortable about, right? Why do they dislike identifying as a male or a female, depending on what sex they are? What kind of experiences have they had that maybe made that sex that they are very alien to them, right? Were they hurt or traumatized at some way, right? Where they say, well, I don't want to identify, I don't want to be this sex because I've seen bad things from this sex. And so as a reaction, maybe they're not even aware of it. They're just internally rejecting their sex, right? We don't really know. I mean, with each individual person, you don't really know what is the genesis of these feelings, right? And in terms of when you mention like stereotypes, obviously we have a lot of bad examples of men and bad examples of women, right? And if someone is just looking at things from a purely kind of personal and subjective perspective, okay, which we all do to some degree, I mean, it's part of who we are, right? We're not robots. We have hearts and souls, and our experiences affect us. This is what it means to be human, right? We can't just imagine that we're just these rational creatures who just 1 + 1 is 2 and that's the end of the story. Of course not. right? So someone may have just seen very bad examples in their lives of one gender or the other or both. And so we have to start, and I think the one episode 68, I believe it was, it says between toxic masculinity, which is a buzzword today, and radical feminism, right? What is what is a man in Islam? What is a woman? And again, we go back to our own models, right? And we look at the Prophet ﷺ as the universal human model, but also as a male. And we look at the male companions, and then we look at the female companions, and we look at the different, and what does it mean to be a man in Islam? What is the nobility of that station, and what is the nobility of the station of being a woman? These are beautiful things, and they're not just random, right? Both sexes should be celebrated for the genius that they have been created with, right? They're not replaceable. If you had a world with just men, it would be a disaster. If you had a world with just women, it would be a disaster, right? We have to have both. And so, very slowly you can start, maybe talking to a person about, again, what are their experiences, hear them out, and then also looking for alternative models and say, look, I agree with you. Yeah, that's a terrible model of masculinity, but guess what? That's not what we're talking about. That's not who the Prophet was, peace be upon him. That's not who his companions were, right? Or yeah, you see women weak and docile and beaten into submission, whatever, a person's coming with, maybe they've seen that in their own experience. Well, I don't want to be like that. I'm a man. They say, well, wait a minute, but that's not what it means essentially to be a woman for us. You want a strong woman? Okay, look at Khadija radiallahu anha, look at Aisha radiallahu anha, right? I mean, when I say strong, it's strength of character, strength of faith, strength of conviction, strength of their moral character and their standing, right? Look at what they achieved in terms of their khilafah on the earth, right? These are beautiful examples of the mothers of the believers, of beautiful examples for our sisters of what it means to be a truly actualized woman, we're in a beautiful sense of womanhood, and what it means to be a truly actualized man in a beautiful sense of manhood too, right? And so I think there has to be a multi-pronged approach, and one that, again, has to realize that each and every person is a unique individual with his or her own trajectory and history and baggage and issues and so on and so forth. And these can run very, very deep. And so there has to be a lot of patience, a lot of compassion, a lot of time for people to work things out. It's not going to happen in 1 or 2 conversations, right? This may be something that really takes a long time for people to work through, and they might not completely resolve their issues, but hopefully they'll get to a place where they can live more easily and more comfortably and more contentedly with the way that they have been created by Allah. That would be mine.
Absolutely, yeah. And especially in terms of women, and you noted in your presentation that we have a culture that says, they would say, oh, Sayyidah Khadija was a businesswoman, so I'm going to become a businesswoman. Whereas in effect, she stopped that when she got married and she looked after the children, and then that sometimes we have these, kind of almost being forced by financial situations where both parents are working and the child isn't, child is in daycare or, kind of not in that model, whereas the Islamic model, I guess in an ideal Islamic model, as you said, it's the responsibility primarily of the men. It's the choice of the woman whether she wants to go in or not. But primarily the responsibility is there, and those ideals which are there in Islam, and unfortunately have kind of been forgotten, or or have been said that, oh, they're not as good. Whereas what we're seeing now is especially the effect on the children growing without a mother, for example, in the house, and not having that Islamic tarbiyah is kind of quite profound, and we don't really look at that from a holistic perspective to why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put these guidelines for us in terms of gender. We have a question here. It's on the approach of having conversations with youth. What would teaching principles look like for educating, preparing, or making young Muslims aware of these topics? What would be the approach of providing a framework or perspective to reconcile with religion and identity as a Westerner and Muslim? What advice is there for what manner in which we'd have these conversations with Muslims on non-Muslims with these points discussed?
Yeah, those are very good questions, all of them, and they come up frequently. Obviously, it's one thing to kind of have a presentation and slides and sort of, put the theoretical model out there, but then how do we bring this into real life? And I would just say that, I've given a number of talks and a number of seminars for educators and on this particular issue, LGBT in general, homosexuality and transgenders, and that's always a question. Okay, how do we bring this into our classroom? How do we bring it to our youth? We need to all, this is a team effort, right? We need to take the ideas, we need to take the principles that some of us have been working on, myself, Brother Mubin Vayed, Brother Wahid Jensen, and others. And then we need people who are experts in dealing with youth, who teach, who are either youth counselors or psychologists, and have that type of skill set to take the material and repackage it, for them, right? It can't be done just by one or two people, but I think we need to have teams of people who say, this is a really critical issue. People are getting really confused on it. We're losing people, some of our youth over this issue from the dean, and we really need to get to them this message. And we're going up against a very, very powerful cultural narrative, which is sort of, completely at odds with what we're saying. The perspective we're saying can be very difficult, because human beings, we're collective creatures, right? We are collective creatures, and it's difficult for many people to really go against the grain, right? It doesn't mean that we don't have to do that. I mean, the grain is often wrong, as Allah says, most people don't know. So if you're just going to follow what everyone else says, well, that's not what it means to be a Muslim. We have to be, prepared to kind of stand up for what's right, and even if it's unpopular. But I do think that there has to be a simplifying of the material. It has to be made available in different formats. I think it should hopefully make its way into Islamic curricula, not just in Islamic schools, because most Muslims in the West don't go to Islamic schools, but maybe have, be creative in terms of online resources and technology, try to bring these topics up more in Islamic conferences for youth, rather than just running away from it, right? Give people a chance to bring their questions and concerns, so they don't just think the elders, so to speak, are ignorant on the issue, right? And let them really get it out and try to provide proper guidance, and then give them a better model, right? Show them how our understanding of what, the models we have of gender identity and gender interaction and sexual interaction and so forth, how it is morally superior, how it is socially superior, how it is emotionally superior for human beings, and healthier, right? If we follow the models that we have been given through the guidance that we've been sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? How this is actually for the betterment and the flourishing of everybody. And that if we leave this, that, we enter into mass confusion. We really have to show people, because so many people, there's such a strong narrative that people just get caught on, I think, propaganda and buzzwords and this and that. And they don't stop to think, what are the results of all of this, right? What are the social repercussions of scuttling the idea of gender? There's a massive bills to be paid, right, on all of these issues. What are the, what are the effects of having a completely loose and open sexual culture? There are books written, it's a disaster. It's a disaster for women, first and foremost. It's a disaster for children. It's a disaster for men. People can't get married, even in the West, and it's not financial. It's just the sexual marketplace, so to speak. I don't like using those terms. Is so skewed now that marriage itself has become so undesirable for many and so unachievable for many, right? Because the equation has been completely undone. In the past, a man usually, he knew he had to court a woman and prove himself and this and that. He's looking to fulfill his needs. Well, there's no free lunch. You've got to be prepared to take care of a woman and have that responsibility. Children might come along. When you take that away and men can just go and sleep with whoever they want, and the women are all expected to be open for that, but who wins in that? Why should a man settle down then? You know, like for a lot of men, and then women, you know, they have their own issues. It's a very, very damaging, the sexual culture of the modern is extremely damaging. For women, it's extremely damaging for men, and it has devastating effects on families and children. And we need to start talking more in those terms, rather than always being on the defensive. Oh, Islam is not backwards, and it's all about freedom and equality and blah, 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 blah. No, it's not. I mean, those things are important to a degree. Yes, but there are other things that are important for human life to flourish. And one of the main ones is to have a strong family culture, right? Families have to be strong. And it doesn't mean every Islamic, Muslim household is, a piece of paradise on earth. Obviously, I mean, we're human beings, we have our problems, and we need to rectify that. We need to rectify our own homes too. We don't want to have miserable families. We want to have good families, but we have to at least have families in order for them to be good families. When you have no family at all, how is that an improvement, right? And we have to be more, I don't want to say on the attack, because that's not the right way to think about it. We have to be more confident in what we have, more confident in our principles, more confident in the direction that we've been given, and not only not feel apologetic about it, but we have to say, no, we're going to go out and take this out to other people. Why? Because other people are suffering. People in the West are suffering. Men are suffering, women are suffering, children are suffering. And what Islam has brought, this is the solution that people need, actually, even outside of the Muslim world, right? That's the attitude. And I think if you have that attitude and you can back it up with good arguments, with good statistics, with good adab, right, with beautiful models from the prophetic seerah and the sunnah and so on and so forth, this is a powerful message that people can be moved by. But when you take an apologetic stance and you're always on the back foot, you're always retreating, you're always just trying to show that you're not really as bad as people say you are, and you're trying to measure yourself up again using someone else's ruler, forget it. First of all, it's never going to work because they created the ruler. It's not going to fit you because they create it for themselves. Number two, this doesn't look very, it doesn't inspire much confidence in youth. And it's not very inspiring when they see their elders just kind of like very coy. I'm not saying to be aggressive, but to be confident, but in an intelligent way and with proper grounding. I think that's very important.
Thank you. You have a comment. Assalamu alaikum, jazakallah khair for a talk on a much needed topic. As a psychiatrist, I haven't seen a patient with gender dysphoria who doesn't have autism or some gender-related trauma or abuse. Can you give some advice on how I can help patients in this area without being put into trouble because of current hostile environment to any kind of challenge to certain way of thinking? I just want to add to that. So we have resources. So there is resources in terms of gender explorative therapy, which we can link. But I guess the individual here is pointing out the, let's just say, professional ban on explorative therapy for gender, and how perhaps if you're a Muslim and you're a Muslim psychiatrist, you're faced with that dilemma if you have a client which and autism obviously is quite, the studies have shown a link between autism and gender dysphoria, obviously early childhood trauma. So we have resources obviously we can send to you. Dr. Sharif, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Again, it's a question that comes up, every time anyone gives a talk on such a topic. I think that, well, first of all, it's interesting to say, so you say either autism or some gender-related trauma or abuse, one or the other, probably sometimes both. That's very interesting to see that there's that correlation there. I would say that, as a psychiatrist, definitely try to help the person with whatever else is going on that you see from your perspective as being related to that. even if they don't see that. So help them with the abuse, help them with the trauma. Autism is a different thing. It's, you can help someone deal with it, but it's kind of a condition that's physiological. I would say, and this is the same, also people come with same-sex attraction. I mean, usually there's so much else going on in terms of also high rates of childhood sexual abuse and many other issues and confidence issues and also sometimes gender identity issues. There's so much else that's going on that you can help the person with, even without directly kind of saying, well, without even directly talking about the issue that we're supposed to not be allowed to talk about. So that's number one. Number two is, if they're a Muslim patient, and again, this is going to depend a lot on your jurisdiction, but it might be possible to, like, okay, first of all, you need to know what your rights are within your jurisdiction. What are you allowed to say and not say? I know there is a principle that the psychiatrist and psychologists are supposed to respect the wishes of their patient. So if you come to someone, if someone comes to you as a psychiatrist or a psychologist, says, I have same-sex attractions and I have religious beliefs that prevent me from acting on these, and I don't want to live a gay lifestyle, you're supposed to say, okay, I will work with you on that. Even if you don't agree personally, you're supposed to give the patient that respect to allow them to have their own approach to it. And I've known some Muslims have reported to me that they've gone to therapy and have been traumatized because they tell the therapist that, and people are so ideologically charged on this issue, right? This becomes a point of deen for them. It's like their aqidah. And you get psychologists just, trying to influence the Muslim patient or the other religious patient from another tradition. And you're going to be miserable until you just accept who you are. And you need to go out and do X, Y, and Z. This is totally unprofessional. This is totally unprofessional. It goes against the ethics of the practice as well. And I think that Muslims and people from other religious groups who are similar in their orientation towards such issues to us need to, and brother, Ali, may Allah give you tawfiq also for spearheading this in the UK. We need to also stand up for our rights to be able to have different opinions on charged issues. What does it mean to have freedom of speech, right? Or to the much touted freedom of speech and freedom of religion and everything else, if when it comes to issues that other people really care about, they clamp down on it and don't allow any dissent. Okay, that's just an empty sure, you can talk about the Trinity and about God. People don't care about that anyway. They consider it a fairy tale. You can talk about whatever metaphysics you want. They don't care. But when you talk about things that they do care about, all of a sudden, where's all of that tolerance, right? So it's important, I think, for religious communities to say, look, once you start telling me I'm not allowed as a Muslim psychologist or to counsel a Muslim patient on his or her own terms, or a Catholic patient or whoever, who says, this is my paradigm, then now you are discriminating, to use the terms of the society, now you're discriminating against me on the basis of my religion, right? You're systematically discriminating against Muslims by outlawing their, some core tenets of their belief, of their faith, that you are putting them under legal, threat of going to jail or losing their license or losing their livelihood if they give expression to their religious beliefs. That doesn't sound like religious freedom to me. I thought I was not supposed to be legally penalized for having or operationalizing core religious beliefs of mine. Okay, this goes into the whole secular state. Brother Paul Williams on Blogging Theology, he's been interviewing Imam Tom Fikini, who has been talking a lot on this issue based on Talal Asad's book about formations of the secular. So I think there are 3 installments so far in that series. If you're interested in this, it's, you can get this idea of how the secular state really is not secular, and it is deeply involved in religion, and it shapes religion and controls it and so forth. So that's number one. Number two, and so I think we do need to, again, start working with others and start standing up. I mean, everyone else is clamoring for their rights. We need to also clamor for the right to be respected, to be able to have our beliefs, to speak about. We're not harming anybody. You can't just define as harm that which you don't agree with, right? And you're cutting people's body parts off and giving puberty blockers to children and all of these things which are horrific, especially, if you look into this. Very little trials done. No one has any idea what the long-term implications are. and they're giving drugs to kids who are too young to consent to what's being done to them. That's going to make them permanently sterile and the osteoporosis by the time they're 17 because they never have proper bone development. Like, this is a nightmare, right? And why are people not raising their voices against this? So the hostile environment, yes, but it has to be challenged. What did people do in the 60s? There was a hostile environment for the LGBT community. They said, we're going to stand up and challenge it. And that's what they did. And now it's the opposite. Okay, well, we need to stand up also, again, without being rude or aggressive or whatever. But this has gone way too far. And if we don't stand up, then it's just going to keep getting more and more and more and more and more. And all of the harm that comes from that is going to continue to increase as well. So I don't know if that really answered the question, but may Allah bless you, brother or sister, and give you strength. It's not easy at all in this environment at all. So
it's really difficult to do Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, but we continue.
It always has been.
To do it.
That's par for the course, right? I mean, look at the prophets and the what they went through. I mean, it was never easy to bring, you know, a message and to have it heard and to, I mean, again, these are things that really touch at the core of reality and of the whole purpose, the whole purpose of life. Right? I mean, that's why religion is it's never a neutral topic, because the implications are huge. The question of the existence of God, this is not a casual question. No matter where you stand on it, it's the most important question. If God exists, then it changes everything. And everything has to revolve around that reality, because there's no reality like that reality. If he doesn't exist also, it has huge implications. In much of Western culture in 19th, 20th century, it's all dealing with the kind of trauma of losing faith in God. Like it was not, you know, this was like a major, major, major civilizational shift that had a lot of, you know, a lot of implications. It was not something that any society can just do casually. So
absolutely. Got one last question. If that's okay. I don't know.
Yeah, okay, because I'm gonna miss Maghrib if I don't go soon. Let me try.
Yes, it's just one quick one. How would you, if any, draw the parallel between body shame and perceived idea of gender? How much do you think body shaming damages the perceived gender role? What is Islam's view on body shame? What is Islam's approach to healing body shame wounds?
So this is not a question I've thought a great deal about, but in terms of body shaming, I don't really know that there's a specific Islamic view on it. I mean, first of all, we are meant to take care of our bodies. We're meant to be healthy. It was known that the Prophet, for women, you know, there's more of a, you know, women can get heavy, especially after they get pregnant and so forth, but within limits. And it was known for men that he actually did not like people to be excessively overweight, and it's not healthy, right? So we're meant to kind of take care of ourselves, but it doesn't mean everyone has to be this ripped GQ model, or that women have to be these slinky figures. I mean, again, these very artificial notions of what it means to be a properly looking man or woman can be very toxic. And in Islam, we're meant to be, you know, we cover our bodies. We're not meant to be flaunting our bodies, male or female, even in same-sex company. You know, we're meant to be mostly covered, right? There are parameters to this. And certainly in the public sphere, Muslims traditionally have worn concealing garments, including men, although technically the awrah for the man is just the navel to the knee. That's like the bare minimum. But in society, you look at Muslim societies, traditionally men wear, just like women almost, like gowns and long sleeves, and usually cover their head with a turban or something. And okay, maybe their neck is showing, but sometimes women, you know, cover their face. If not, then a hijab. So it's actually quite similar. But the idea is that, you know, I'd say this idea of body shaming is not something that is part of our tradition. And also, I would say this kind of stress on the centrality of the body and what it looks like and all of that is also not part of our tradition, right? Again, we're meant to be healthy, but not to be obsessive over what does my male body look like and what does my female body look like and so forth. If someone does have body shaming wounds, what is Islam's approach to healing it? Again, I don't know if there's a specific like Islamic prescription for it, other than to, to try to come to a different appreciation of one's body, right? And seeing it as a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, something that one should take care of, and also realizing that it is not something that has to be held up to this, very idealistic, unrealistic standard. That was not meant to be. And there's a famous hadith, and I'll have to stop with this because I'm really running out of time here. Where the Prophet ﷺ says that Allah does not look at your shapes or your wealth, and in one, it does not look at your shapes or your bodies, right? Literally the bodies, but He looks at your heart and your deeds. So in the end of the day, right, this is what counts for us as Muslims, right? This is what counts for us as Muslims. The body is important. We're not like traditional Christianity is very much anti-body in a sense, and Islam incorporates the body. It incorporates the body into the prayer. It incorporates the body into everything. We have to clean our bodies properly. We have to make wudu. We have to, cleanse ourselves, take, ghusl. We have to clean ourselves with water when we use the bathroom and so forth. The body is important, but there's a hierarchy, right? The body has its place, but what is more important is the heart and the deeds. And this is what we take to our graves with us. By the time we go to the grave, no matter what you look like, you're not going to be looking too good a week or two later, let alone a couple months when you're all, ramim, like you're just kind of scattered dust. Your body's going to decompose eventually, right? But what remains is your faith and your deeds. So I'm going to leave it at that. I literally have 6 minutes before the other end.
No, thank you so much. Thank you for your time and the detailed presentation. I pray Allah continues to give you continued success in this. And thank you for speaking about a charged topic, a difficult topic, and addressing and as you said, continuing to do Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy al Munkar and being a resource for so many people who've benefited from your work. May Allah bless you. We will post the slides later so that people can.
I'll send them to you, and you can put them in the link to
have access to them. And Jazakumullah khair, khair al-jaza for your efforts. And no, inshallah, we will join another webinar which will continue this topic of gender and identity, inshallah. In the meantime, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.